So I think you'll find that there's a lot of synergy and integration in the ways in which Hermie, GP, and I think and write about authenticity. That's not surprising, at least from my vantage point, because I certainly follow their work very closely. And so I'm going to draw upon some of those themes, but also try to push us to think about the power dynamics involved in authenticity and how authenticity has been romanticized and co-opted in ways that promotes injustice rather than the freedom and liberation that it promises. Now, my research focuses primarily on how people cultivate positive identities in diverse work settings. And so in that context, I'm going to point out a few paradoxes or tensions, which can be so extreme that they become paradoxical. But the takeaway for this is that essentially, we in this quest for finding ourselves, being ourselves, discovering, constructing, aligning identities and images, we want to have our cake and eat it too. Okay? And that becomes a fundamental problem, not just a psychological problem, because with cognitive dissonance, we often move through the world and reconcile our own contradictions and, reframe our dissonance and inconsistencies in ways that put the responsibility on the context and allow us to continue to sort of flow into different fantastical beliefs about who we are. But we're also, because of the ways in which we set up incentives and rewards, we create social problems in our pursuit of having our cake and eating it too, which I call the alignment quest. So the first dilemma is that in order to cultivate and construct more positive identities, we seek self-enhancement. Okay? And we get social feedback, as well as our internal narrative and dialogue that process social feedback. That's essentially giving us messages that say that we're good enough, we matter, and if we get into a competitive orientation, then we may also translate that into saying, I measure up by whatever the standard or metric may be within a particular context. Okay? But the authenticity conversation also says we want to be known and understood for who we really are, putting that in quotes, because we'll problematize that a bit this morning, or continue to do so. Hermie and GP have already introduced that conversation. So how do you sustain this positive sense of self while at the same time, in order to feel real, you also want people to know and validate and affirm your flaws? That's one tension. The second is that we want to belong, we want to be a part of the group, but particularly in Western cultures, we also place an increasing primacy on distinctiveness. Okay, so I want to be different, I want to be viewed as rare and special. That feeds into the authenticity, rhetoric, and dynamic, but I also want to feel like I matter, and I can't feel like I matter if nobody notices if I'm in the room or not. If I get up and go to the bathroom and I don't come back, did it matter that I showed up to this conference today if nobody even notices that I left, right? So there's a social experience as well. So these underlying desires for identity construction, which is more of the internal work, but of course we use social feedback, so there's social aspects of it, and the image projection, just how I'm presenting myself to others, are driven by those four underlying motives: Rarely do they all converge. Often there's tension that we're reconciling internally as well as interpersonally. But we live our life, at least in 21st century United States and other cultures that have been influenced and shaped by our rhetorical ideals. We have a hashtag, a banner, call it what you will, free to be me. Now, on the surface, there's nothing wrong with that statement. It's a virtuous aspiration. It's a timeless aspiration. We could quote a lot of philosophers. You all have heard them. I'm not going to quote them now because the philosophers that we quote as the originators of the construct of authenticity as a virtuous aspiration are very homogeneous. So you can make the references in your own reading and reviewing, but for now, let's just call this a shared cultural aspiration and experience that's connected to a sense of human rights and liberation. It involves courageous vulnerability and purposeful transparency. And within my own framing in writing and teaching around authenticity, I'm generally connecting it to a noble or purpose-driven pursuit of constructing, building, generating, in short, strengthening other people and strengthening social systems. So the work that I've done with the Center for Positive Organizations at University of Michigan has focused on positive deviance as a catalyzing force for building organizations that are generative and sustainable and positive contributors to society. So within that framework, authenticity is quite palatable. But what else is going on? That particularly over the past decade, and especially over the past 18 months, that the rhetorical appeal of being free to be me has led to a seductive socio-political force whereby deception is packaged as authenticity. And if there's enough unfiltered self-expression, then society consumes that as a representation of the real thing. So instead of then constructing human rights and promoting liberation, locally, community, globally, that the same hashtag, free to be me, can also be used in a manipulative way. Now, at the foundation of this dynamic is egocentrism. John Perro talked about narcissism. We're essentially talking about the same dynamics and forces. So first we have to problematize our own attraction to the growing conversation around authenticity. Say, number one, what do we mean? And number two, why is it even attractive to us? And then in extending that conversation, to whom is it really available? Is this an open invitation for us to be free to be ourselves? Or is this another way of sort of framing systems of injustice and inequity, but packaging them in a rhetorical, socio-politically seductive message that we're all free to be ourselves? If we don't address the notion of penalties for coloring outside of the lines, living outside of the box, and consider when those penalties are imposed, not equivalently across the board, but disparately, then we would believe that inclusion is open access, bring your whole selves to work, one size fits all solution, Hermie, billion-dollar market, right? Everybody wants a book to learn how they can bring themselves to work too, because it's just that simple, just be yourself. So in my own writing, I've been working to disentangle conceptually so that I can be more effective pragmatically. disentangling between these exhortations to bring our whole selves within cultural contexts, and also recognizing the need and the power and impact for us to exercise positive deviance. So this visual captures a couple of things. One, that the normative convention is not inherently misaligned with our authentic self. Because, and this is the box in the middle, the authentic self is multifaceted. So I can find at least one identity that allows me to hook into most situations. The question is, how much of myself can I bring into that situation, or how much of myself do I have to leave out of that situation? So when I started writing my dissertation on the experiences of Black medical students, which was a few years ago at this point, and I went on the job market, and I wondered how authentic I should be in presenting my own research. And so I had this slide in my deck, and I said, I'm just going to go for it. It's no need in people hiring me and then finding out, what I'm really interested in. I'm just going to go for it. And there had been an article published in Essence magazine a few months before. It was a cover story, and the title was, "How Black Can You Be When You Go to Work Every Day?" So, I had the old school scanner, like the flatbed. There was no flatbed scanner. There was no iPhone clicking, but I went through this whole process. I scanned and I just put that in because for me, that was a question around authenticity, and that's still the same question. Now, since then, my work has expanded in this vein of constructing and cultivating positive identities to talk about how we often deviate from norms and conventions in order to bring our best selves. Because when we're at our best, we're extending beyond a typical state of being. We're engaging our strengths and talents in ways that make valuable and valued contributions within a social context. So we are moving literally outside of the box in order to enter into that extraordinary state of being. And that too is authentic, okay? The question for me after the past 18 months is, who has permission to be mediocre? And when do we begin to interrogate the norms and practices around coloring outside of the lines in ways that allow us to be mediocre, to be messy? Hermie was giving me flashbacks about my first years teaching here in the lead classrooms, in the amphitheaters, with the feedback and yeah. I wasn't great. I was 27. I was African American. I was teaching a required leadership course to 180 students at the Harvard Business School. I was not what they expected. For other reasons, I probably was not what they expected. So that's one question. The next question, to extend the conversation, is, and this is where I start to interrogate my own work, because up until this point, most of my writing has been about authenticity as the alignment between internal experience and external expressions. And you may have seen, I've written that, I've defined that, published it many places. So in preparing for this conversation, I said, okay, so, what have I learned over the past decade about authenticity? Is that all it is? Is it just about me and how I'm feeling in a particular moment, in a particular situation? Or is it the case, perhaps, that authenticity is not about me, but it is, in fact, about the space between? And so the space between that I'm going to highlight is the space between us. It's the authentic encounter. Now, in focusing on the authentic encounter, we're lowering the bar, because we recognize that the fluidity of our own identities and expressions and experiences grants us the permission to be realistic. It's rare that we're fully ourselves in a sustained manner or fashion. There are a lot of things that are going through my head right now that you don't need to know about. It is not at all relevant. Okay? And that's not why you're here, and that's not why Robin and Lakshmi asked me to offer some thoughts about authenticity. So, I mean, built into our ability to connect is a self-editing, self-regulatory function that is productive. It's useful, it's helpful. When it comes to talking about issues of social justice and racial justice in particular, often gender conversations as well, but I'm going to go to what I would say is the hottest place in the fire, and my own experience of teaching and consulting, and that's in facilitating conversations around race with diverse groups. That we enter into this conversation and we have a shared agreement that says, okay, let's talk. Let's talk. We're going to have a conversation. I'm the faculty member. We've signed up for the course. We've signed up for the program. We all know where this is heading, right? We got on the train together. You know, let's go. So the conversation unfolds. I throw out a question. Somebody responds. Someone builds upon that. Throw out another question. Response. Building. Then identity abrasions. Triggers. Oh, I'm not sure how I feel about what Samantha just said. Is that what she really thinks about people like us? Oh my gosh. I'm looking at Sadal's face. What is she thinking about what I just said? What time are the snacks? When can I get out of this room? When is break time? And often, people leave the room in tears. Has anyone had this experience? Teaching, being in the conversation yourself, right? At least half of the room, at least half of the room. So the irony is we get seduced into this space of this conversation of the belief that we're going to have an authentic encounter and generate shared understanding, but we want to do so by jumping immediately from inquiry to holding environment, from intimacy through our disclosures and revelations to the holding environment, to then moving into a process of sustained inquiry with the belief that we will then deconstruct and rebuild shared spaces. So when I first came into this room 15 years ago, it seemed huge and I felt so small. And I left HBS several years ago. I came back for the Gender and Work Conference. I couldn't come to the first two because of family obligations, where I was having a baby and everything. And so when I first came back 3 years ago, it felt a little smaller, but it still felt strange because there had been some distance. It didn't yet feel like I had been part of building a shared space. In my mind, it still felt like this was my world and this was their space. So what has happened over the past 3 years that when I was sitting here, I keep looking at the tables, like, are these the same amount of tables that we've always had? They feel like so few tables this year. And it's because of the connections and the authentic encounters that we've had over time. So the point is that this process takes time. I'm talking about a 15-year time span. We want to have a conversation about race and then walk away in 30 minutes or 3 hours with everyone feeling good about ourselves. Okay? And not investing in the relationship process, not factoring in the need for accountability. That authentic expressions also involve some accountability around what we offer up And there will be processes of constructing and reconstructing boundaries. And there will be moments when we may feel like Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, if you understand that metaphor, where you suddenly look around and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm naked. Like, I'm all the way out there. How did I end up in this place, and where am I going with this? So since Frederick Douglass has gotten a lot of attention lately, I thought we'd just throw him in there. It's really important these days. It does come down to personal choice. I mean, we have to take the first step with the recognition and assumption that authenticity and authentic encounters are risks, that we may get some pushback, there may be discomfort involved, but we prefer to be true to ourselves, even at the hazard of incurring the ridicule of others, rather than to be false and incur my own abhorrence. So I wanted to close with a poem because I've been writing about this topic for a few years now, but, and after the election, Robin and I actually collaborated on a piece about the women who voted for various candidates and how that led to the election results. But I found myself dissatisfied in terms of authentic expression, and so I had to move to a different medium. And I was thinking about these authentic encounters and, you know, can we just talk? And what would it look like? What would it feel like if we could enter into conversation? So this poem is called Daybreak. Pardon me, I wouldn't want to be impolite. It's just that you're stepping on my soul. Pardon me, because I would surely hate to be rude, but it's just that you're squashing my hope. Pardon me, I don't mean any harm. It's just that you're smothering my sanity. Pardon me, I don't mean to be insensitive. It's just you snatched away my safety. You hitched it to the back of a truck and dragged it down a Texas road. Pardon me, I really didn't want to offend anyone. It's just you're sucking all the oxygen out of the room and I can't breathe. Pardon me, because you probably didn't notice, but the good guys have been misbehaving lately, and I think you forgot to punish them for breaking the rules. Pardon me, because I know this isn't a competition because all lives matter. But somehow it seems your need for power and wealth has trumped my human rights. So pardon me, because I didn't mean to be disruptive, but I think you forgot to mention in your pleas for rationality and reason that scientists have empirical evidence that racism is a thing, like xenophobia, genocide, rape, sexual assault, bigotry, patriarchy, and other social pathologies of the human condition. They've been practiced, refined, tested, battled, and yet they endure. So pardon me, because I surely hate to interrupt your victory dance, and I'm not the one to rain on your parade, but you're marching through my here and now as if then and there never happened. So do you mind if I ask you a few questions, since you're in such a good mood? Like, didn't you come from somewhere? Where did the parade route begin? Pardon me, I've always been one to play nice, but my wounds need to be exposed, aired, cleansed before they can heal. And they've gotten a little infected by the silence of oppression. Whew, what a relief. A tougher surface is covering my thin skin. So we can finally stop tiptoeing around assumptions and just deal with the data-driven facts. We can exercise checks and balances. We can celebrate progress. We can hold each other accountable for our words and our actions. We can forge healthy boundaries and exercise moral discernment. You know, like rational, reasonable human beings. Thank you.